Okay, so I'm going to keep this video reasonably short. I thought I would go through the Tacitus with you. Tacitus is quite dense, quite difficult to make out on your own. I have tried to make this easier by giving you, although I've given you about 8 pages of Tacitus here, I've put red boxes around the bits that actually matter. So whilst you are absolutely welcome to read the whole thing, and Tacitus, I would always advise Tacitus, he's great fun. The red boxes will give you everything that you're after, really. So Tacitus's Annals, which is a history written year by year, actually picks up with the reign of Tiberius. But very near the beginning, you can see this is Book 1, Chapter 2. He first of all does sort of a retrospective on Augustus and describes his funeral as well. So he manages to start with the emperor following Augustus and yet also bring Augustus into it, which is useful for us. Tacitus was writing around about 115, 116 CE, so maybe 5, 6, 7 years before Suetonius. They were contemporaries, they will have probably known each other quite well. And so they are both, he's looking back, 100 years or so to the death of Augustus. And so he's another of these sources that allows us to say, how did people, in this case, the very elite of the Roman Senate, how did they look back on Augustus and how positive was their response? So I'm just going to read some of the bits through, only the red boxes, as I say, and you should feel perfectly at liberty to only do the red boxes too. So it says, when after the slaughter of Brutus and Cassius, so that's Philippi, there were no more republican armies, Pompeius, so Sextus Pompey, had been overwhelmed off Sicily, Lepidus cast aside, Antony killed, not even the Julian party had any leader left but Caesar, so that of course is Augustus. He, putting aside the name of Triumvir, presented himself, so presented, he doesn't believe it, but he presented himself as consul and as content with his tribunician prerogative, so with the tribunician power for protecting the plebs, the people. But when he had enticed the soldiers with gifts, so he's made the soldiers his with money, he's got the people on side with food, so he gave out food to the people, and everyone with the sweetness of inactivity. So after all those civil wars and busyness, everyone just, the soldiers were happy with money, the people were happy with food, and he's enticing them. He rose up gradually and drew to himself the responsibilities of senate, magistrates and laws, without a single adversary. So this phrase, he drew to himself the responsibilities of senate, magistrates and laws. I mean, Tacitus basically sees him as a dominant and dominating figure. He does it gradually, which is true, without a single adversary, since the most defiant had fallen in the battle line or by prescription. So he's just killed everyone who stood against him, and then so no one does anymore, and so he just takes the power to himself. The rest of the nobles, each in proportion to his readiness for servitude, were exalted by wealth and honours. So, as long as you toady to Augustus, you get money, you get honour, you get power. And so he suggests basically that he buys the soldiers, feeds the people, and the Senate just learn to toady. Okay. Nor did the provinces reject that state of affairs, the command of the Senate and the people having become suspect owing to the contest of the powerful and the greed of magistrates. And so he says the provinces were happy with this. The contest of the powerful, you think all those civil wars and so on, the provinces were very happy to take a dominant, calm, organised system. Okay? But there's some damning phrases in there that he pretends to be content with powers, but he's not. He wants more. Okay, and then he carries on. So this is at the point of Augustus' death. As for war, none survived at that time except against the Germans, more to erase the infamy of the army lost with Varus than through any desire of extending the empire. So you might remember Varus was lost with the legions in 9 CE, and so Tacitus is quite happy to point out the infamy of this. This is a terrible disaster. At home, things were calm. Magistrates of the same names are still consuls and that sort of thing. But the younger men had been born after the Actian victory. the majority even of the elderly in the course of the citizens' wars? What size was the remaining proportion which seen the Republic? So it's a really clever point, this. Augustus has lived so damn long, nobody actually remembers what things were like when the Senate was in charge, and so he just becomes the way things are. You know, if you go all the way back to, like, I don't know, 31 or something, just Actium, lots of people remember how it's meant to be. But by 14 CE, I mean, that's another 44 years on. Most people who remember are just dead. So this is a clever point from Tacitus. As a result, along with the changed state of the community, nowhere did any aspect of the old-time convention remain untouched. Equality was cast aside. All looked to the orders of the princeps. So Tacitus is basically clear that he is totally in control. Total power goes to Augustus. While Augustus had the strength in the years to support both himself and his household and peace. Okay, so whilst he was in charge, everyone looked to him, and then he starts thinking about the people who are coming next. But we're not interested in that. Okay, some really nice bits here about his death and how he died and who involved in that. And as I say, you're very welcome to read it through, but I'm not going to take up your time with it. So, Tacitus then uses the funeral, and he uses this as a literary set piece. So he describes the funeral, and he's going to describe the people at the funeral who are saying, "Oh, what a lovely bloke," and the people at the funeral who are saying, "Oh, what a horrible bloke." There's no way he knows what people actually said at the funeral, so this is a made-up series of conversations. So really it's Tacitus saying what he thinks about Augustus. So, on the day of the funeral, soldiers stood as if forming a garrison, much to the derision of those who had seen personally or heard from their parents about that day of still undigested servitude of freedom, served up again unsuccessfully, when the slaughtered dictator seemed to some the worst of acts, to others the finest. So the fact that you have to have soldiers even guarding the funeral, they say, that's ridiculous. What's happened to freedom? What's happened to the way the state should be? So again, when you're doing this, you can think Tacitus really sees the power of soldiers as being important here. So let me get this phrase. Among the perspicacious, amongst those who had clear sight, his life was variously extolled, so praised or criticised. And this is what I mean. You're going to have one lot saying, "Wow, what a guy," one lot saying, "Oh, dreadful." So those who were praising him, the former, said that because of devotion to his parent, so that's Julius Caesar, and the requirements of the state, in which at that time there had been no place for law, he had been driven to civil war. He had no choice, which could be neither prepared for nor maintained by good behaviour. Made many concessions to Antony while avenging himself on the killers of his father, many concessions to Lepidus after the latter had aged from apathy and the former had been sunk by his lusts. There had been no other remedy for the fatherland than to be ruled by one man. But it wasn't a kingly rule, it wasn't a dictatorship, it was a princeps. The empire was cordoned by the sea of ocean, or distant streams, legions, provinces, fleets, everything was interconnected. There was legality among the citizens, restraint among the allies, and the city was magnificent in its apparel. A few things have been handled by force to ensure peace. So, yes, okay, there was a bit of violence, there was a bit of illegality, but he had to do it. It was Antony's fault, it was Lepidus' fault, it was the killers of Julius Caesar's fault. He, instead, was calm. He brought peace to the whole empire, and the city was made magnificent in its building program. There are probably echoes in here, actually, of the Res Gestae. But notice, Tacitus is very clever, the people who praise him get a very short paragraph, the people who blame him get a longer paragraph. Said on the other side that devotion to his parent and the times in the state had been taken up as a screen. It was all a pretense. In reality, it was a desire for domination, that veterans had been mustered by money, by lavishness, an army taken by a juvenile in private capacity. So remember that start of the Res Gestae, again being echoed here, the age of 19, at my own expense, lavishness. Yeah. I raised an army. So it's an illegal army bought, bribed the consul's legions, pretended to support the Pompeian party, so fighting with Hirtius and Pansa. After the slaughter of Hirtius and Pansa, although whether they'd been killed by the enemy or perhaps by poison and Caesar's engineering. So here's the negativity, is this a malevolent, clever, bad person who pretends to care about Caesar, pretends to be on the side of Hirtius and Pansa, but is all about seeking power for himself. The consulship had been extorted from an unwilling senate. You might remember the centurion with either you make him consul or this will, and showing his sword to them. The arms which he'd been given to deal with Antony were turned against the state, so he marched up, fought Antony, then he joins with Antony and marches back on Rome, where Cicero had tried to use him and dump him and had failed. The prescription of citizens, the distributions of land had not been praised even by those who did them. So, of course, the ends of Cassius and Brutus had been a concession to paternal antagonisms, so he had to get rid of them, perhaps because of his dad, but it was proper to forego private hatred for public good. He should really have just accepted the shame of not avenging his father in order to avoid a civil war. But he didn't, no. But Pompeius had been deceived by a pretend peace, Lepidus by pretending to be friendly, and Antony had been enticed with treaties, married to his sister, and then had paid the penalty of guile, cunning, with his death. So Tacitus here presenting him as a cunning, manipulative, dissimulating figure who had never really cared about his father or the state. He just wanted power. Peace there had been. Yes, okay, there was the Roman peace. But glory, there had been the Lollian disaster, which we never looked at. It's not as major as the Varian disaster. That was dreadful in 9 CE. The killing at Rome of Verones, Egnatii and Iulii. So, murders, executions in Rome. And then there's the family behaviour. Nero's wife had been abducted from him. So he had, of course, taken Nero's wife Livia from him and then made her his wife, which is why Tiberius and Drusus are only his stepchildren in the first instance. Tiberius, of course, is adopted. There's the mockery of consulting priests on the question whether it was right for her to wed him after conceiving, but before producing a child. Well, I mean, there you go. So he actually married Livia while she was still pregnant with her previous husband's child. There's Pollio's luxury, although you might remember he flattened Pollio's villa. Finally, there was Livia, her burden on the state as a mother. There's some real misogyny in there, being matched by that on the Caesar's family as a stepmother. Tacitus retails here all the vindictive nastiness of Romans to powerful women. Nothing was left with which to honour the gods, since he wished himself to be worshipped with temples and the likeness of a divinity. Yeah, so he wanted to be worshipped, he wanted to be, this word, the likeness of a divinity, so he's not really one, but he pretends to be one, he's like one. Even Tiberius had not been adopted as successor because of any affection, but because he had insight into the man's arrogance and savagery, and by the basest of comparisons he sought glory for himself. I mean, effectively that's saying he only chose Tiberius because he knew Tiberius was so awful, people would think, oh well, Augustus was better. So far from picking the best man for the state, he's picked the very worst he could find. That's pretty bleak. Okay, as for his burial, so Augustus' burial, once it had been completed according to custom, a temple and heavenly rituals were decreed, so he is deified. Prayers were then redirected towards Tiberius, and then this is less less Tacitus's attitude to Augustus, but a bit of Tiberius's. Tiberius, for his part, began to talk about the magnitude of command and his own limitations. So Tiberius hesitated to take this position, And then he said, only the divine Augustus had been capable of such a great undertaking on his own. Having been summoned by Augustus for partnership, he had learned by experience how difficult, how steep was the burden of ruling everything. So, Tacitus is quoting there Tiberius as saying, really, very few people can live up, or nobody can live up to Augustus. Okay, so when you go through this passage and make some notes from it, you're going to want to pick out that sense that Tacitus gives both positives and negatives, that he makes them in a literary context by imagining people talking at the funeral. He's no idea what people said at the funeral. That he presents those positives and negatives, but he gives far more room and far more weight to the negatives. So for Tacitus, he is not really very positive about Augustus. He's not positive about emperors, full stop. He sees them as just a form of monarchy and domination in every way. So, read it for yourself. Feel free to read all of it, but you don't have to. Those red boxes will carry you through, and you can either read it in the PDF for yourself, or you can read it straight off the video screen if that's more preferable. Okay, I hope that is clear. As with the Suetonius, please make sure you give some examples. Don't just say Tacitus gives both positives and negatives. Put them in the context of the funeral. Give one or two of the positives, one or two of the negatives. Give a sense of how Tacitus is sort of unpicking the screen of Augustus. Augustus pretended to be things, but really he was just ambitious and power hungry. And you might want to think about whether you find which of those views you find more compelling. Is it the care for his father, or is it the ambitious, power-hungry young thug? You pick for yourself, really. Okay.